that didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know why he was there. He refuses to use the term radical Islamic terrorism. He refuses to use the term. I don't even know if he knows what the hell's going on. I really don't. Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on. A poll from Center for Security Policy released data showing 25% of those polled agreed that violence against Americans, these are people that are here, by the way, people here, 25, not 1%. By the way, 1% would be unacceptable. 1% is unacceptable. 25% of those polled agreed that violence against Americans here in the United States is justified as part, think of that, as part of the global jihad. Until we are able to determine and understand this problem and the dangerous threat it poses, our country cannot be the victim of horrendous attacks by people that believe only in jihad.
All right, welcome back to the program. That's Trump with that inflammatory rhetoric. I'm sure Loretta Lynch is trying to figure out how to prosecute him even as we speak. I'm joined now by Andrew Bostom. He's an associate professor of medicine at Brown University, but also an author, a well-published author, I should say. One of his books is Sharia versus Freedom. Another is The Legacy of Jihad. So he knows a little bit about the legacy of Islamic totalitarianism. I want to start, Andrew, just by asking you, before we get into the Trump, my contention is that with their refusal to call it radical Islam, what they are doing is actually the exact opposite of it's exactly what they claim to not want to do. They want to not impugn all Muslims, but by refusing to call it radical Islam, they are impugning all Muslims. Are they not?
I'm totally confused by what they're doing. And Hillary Clinton's recent statement in her interview with George Stephanopoulos, her former assistant, or her husband's former assistant, was just even murkier. She actually used the term radical Islam and then backed away from it. It's complete nonsense. Look, Sam, I just, one of the things that Trump did, which is so important and which is not being addressed in any of these very hostile interviews that he's receiving, is that he used hard metrics, the kind of things that I'm used to, that you referred to my book, Sharia versus Freedom. I mean, a lot of what I presented as background and evidence for the global reaffirmation of Sharia are the kinds of polling data, whether it's international or domestic, of Muslim populations that Mr. Trump was referring to, and I think quite appropriately. So you had that one clip where he talks about, the attitudes sanctioning violence, but he also mentioned, and this is Kellyanne Conway, and we've talked about this before, she's a very respected political pollster. She was commissioned to do this poll for the Center for Security Policy. As we discussed, 51% of Muslims in this poll wanted the Sharia to replace U.S. constitutional law in whole or in part. And this is very consistent with previous polling from U.S. Muslims, which goes back to 2012, where, if anything, this figure was higher. That figure, it was 33% around the time of the 2012 presidential election, where Muslims wanted the Sharia to replace U.S. constitutional law, and 58% at that point in the fall of 2012 felt that there should be criminal penalties for criticizing Islam. In other words, they rejected our First Amendment in favor of Sharia blasphemy law. And I think the larger context for this, Sam, which touches directly upon immigration, is if you look at the global attitudes, they are worse. 77% of Muslims from the world's largest Sunni population, so that would be Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Egypt, and the Sunni majority of Nigeria, 77% want the Sharia to be the law of the land, 83% of Shiite Iranians want the Sharia to be the law of the land. If you look at attitudes about reestablishing a caliphate, maybe not exactly along the lines of ISIS, but pretty darn close historically, 65% of Muslims from 4 very representative countries, Morocco, Egypt, Pakistan, and Indonesia, want the recreation of a caliphate. If you look at what's going on at the UN, which shows you that Islam is really not a religion per se as Westerners or non-Muslims view religion. It is more of a political religious entity. In the UN, the largest voting bloc is the Organization of the Islamic Conference. This represents the entire global Muslim ummah or community, all the major Muslim nations. They have as their stated goal, this goes back to the 1980s, but they formally created a Cairo Declaration, which would replace instruments like our Bill of Rights, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Islam, which is a Sharia-based conception of human rights, which abrogates the basic rights that are enshrined in our Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment. And that is their stated goal. Sam, there is no modern parallel to this phenomenon.
Right. And that leaves us, I want to talk to you about this because, I played some clips, and when we talk to military people, they constantly bring in this Shiite versus Sunni kind of thing where we can get the Sunnis to fight the Shiites and we have to be, and my thing is, we're talking military strategy here, and somehow the religion keeps coming in. Isn't there a disconnect if we have to bring the religion in? Isn't there some sort of when we fight a war, we fight as Americans. Whatever your religion, you fight as an American, right? And yet,
yes.
And yet in this conflict, in the conflict that exists over in the Middle East, it seems like it's a more of a religious thing than even a geopolitical thing. And I think that should give us pause before we just go tromping through there saying, well, we're Americans and we can take care of this.
Absolutely, Sam. Look at our bitter experiences in both Iraq and Afghanistan. We went there on the pretext, really, it wasn't just about 9/11. It was, obviously, in part, but also the cure, supposedly, was that you could democratize these countries by essentially doing what we did to post-war Japan. Of course, we never did what we did to post-war Japan.
We
didn't enshrine the Shintoism after we absolutely crushed the Japanese. We replaced their entire system. So what we were left with in Iraq and Afghanistan after these, basically putting down insurgencies, at least temporarily, was that we literally enshrined the Sharia in both countries, and perhaps we couldn't have done otherwise, because if you look at Pew polling data, post-liberation Iraq, post-liberation Afghanistan, in Afghanistan, 99% want the Sharia to remain the law of the land. In Iraq, it's 91%. And so you've touched upon something that's critical, is that we can talk about temporizing, political, military strategies to try and pit Sunni animosity against Shiite animosity for some sort of short-term goal, however defined it is, whether it's well-defined or ill-defined. But in the end, when you look at something like the entire Ummah coming together in this Organization of Islamic Cooperation and literally wanting to replace global instruments that enshrine universal human rights, we have to say that this is not going to work on any sort of a long-term basis.
Yeah, okay. Now, we got to take that one step further. By our acknowledgement of their rejection of democracy, we are bolstering their position that democracy is not the supreme law of the land, that democracy has no superiority over any kind of other law like communism or Sharia. And we've done this repeatedly throughout the past decades. We have basically forced our representational form of government to take a backseat to other forms of government in the way of saying that they're all equal, which they are not, because the other forms of government believe in their superiority. How can we possibly win this?
We can't under these circumstances. The best we can hope for, again, are these sort of temporizing solutions. Now, sometime when you have an attack that seemed to be largely orchestrated from Afghanistan, and you go in and you even ally with the Northern Alliance, who are also Sharia supremacists, but they chase away those that are the Taliban and Al Qaeda that are actively plotting from their sanctuaries. But that's a totally different situation than what you're aptly describing, which is a long-term strategy which says, no, we don't accept Sharia totalitarianism in any of its guise. None of these countries, whether they sell us oil or not, can be deemed as allies. In fact, they're really long-term adversaries. And we have to craft a different kind of long-term strategy, some of which, as many people have been saying for a long time, should depend on energy independence, if that's the hook by which they're grabbing us.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so quickly, we've got another minute left. I know you wanted to weigh in on Trump saying, keep all the Muslims out, but it is incendiary rhetoric, although it is resonating with people. My take would be to say, keep everybody out. Let's shut down the border. We're just going to shut it down until we figure stuff out. He's singling out Muslims. What is your take on that?
Well, I think Rand Paul sort of tried the other approach, recently. That was really what I understand his bill to have been. I think again, though, when Trump is starting to open up this idea about Sharia supremacism and these attitudes that we're importing into this country and those that exist in our country already, I think it's a very, very legitimate argument, and I think it would be more akin to saying that we don't have to be accepting communists during the height of the Cold War. And again, people are going to have to wrap their minds around the fact that Islam is largely a politico-religious ideology. Yes, it has religious trappings, but the Sharia is a political totalitarian ideology, and people must begin to understand that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Andrew Bostom, thank you so much for coming on the program.